Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Jenn Lim. I will tell you all about Jenn in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is the show that focuses on the good stuff, but sometimes the stuff which is pushed to the side, the caring, the commitment, the conviction we feel toward others. And when you do it as a leader, as you will discover that Jenn Lim is, you do it to bring people together and to energize the organization to achieve lasting, sustainable, and positive results. Welcome, Jane. I want to welcome Jenn. Excuse me.
It's okay. Thank you, John. Honored to be here.
That's okay. I want to tell folks all about you. You have an extraordinary background. Jenn Lim is the CEO of Delivering Happiness, company that she and Tony Hsieh, the late CEO of Zappos, founded to create a happier cultures in companies. I'll get it. I'm sorry, boy. I'm really. And Jenn wrote a book called Delivering Happiness, which was a New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller, and my goodness, sold 1 million copies. That is extraordinary. And I did confess to Jenn that I'm jealous, but it's okay. Anyway,
just so you're not so jealous, actually, Tony officially wrote that book. I helped him launch it and run it, but that was Tony.
Well, it's positive to you. So anyway, but more importantly, it's the net result, and it's how it enabled people to have a pathway to change their cultures and do it for the better. You have a brand new book called Beyond Happiness, which is we're going to focus on today. Beyond Happiness, How Authentic Leaders Prioritize Purpose and People for Growth and Impact. Powerful title. You are a member of the Global Happiness Council of Work and Well-Being, and your company is on the top Inc. 5000, which is pretty darn cool. And you have been featured in lots of business publications, online and cable, and a bunch of other places. And I think you are located in Oakland Hills, California. Am I correct? Good.
That is correct. That's where I am right now.
Now, let's get down to the business. So happiness is, I think, an elusive topic, but how do you define it, Jenn?
It is elusive in some ways because it can be so subjective. So that's why when we worked on happiness, we really wanted to use the science of it. So science-based happiness, positive psychology, things that we can point back to, even if there's a big naysayer in the room that's saying, I don't want happiness, happiness doesn't belong in my workplace. So for us, that goes back to the science, and how science defines it is that there are certain different levers of how we increase our happiness. Number one is being self-aware of our authentic selves. Number two is having a sense of control. Number three, having a sense of progress. Number four, having a sense of connectedness. And ultimately, number five, most sustainable happiness is having a higher purpose. And that's, doing something that's being a part of something that's bigger than yourself, but also for companies, doing something more than just making more profits. So that's why we bring it back to the science. And so there's that.
Okay, good. Well, you and I, we had an offline chat, and I love the concept of happiness. But for me, what you described is more what I would call joy. Joy is finding meaning, purpose, and sustainment, where happiness and moments of happiness. But for me, and correct me if I'm wrong, happiness is more transitory. Do you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I think, I'm really glad you bring that up, because it's debatable, because at the end of the day, it's how we define it. And kind of like the word sustainability or diversity and inclusion, like these are all terms that we hear on a day-to-day basis, some more than ever, but it comes back down to how we as individuals want to define it for ourselves and therefore our organizations and work places and teams. So depending on what book you're reading, they can be suggesting joy is synonymous in some ways of what I've been reading and studying of how, what sustainable happiness truly means. So I think it just comes back down to the person, and that's why it's so important to be clear in communicating what it actually means for ourselves.
Well, I did a little digging on it, and about, as you know, in our Declaration of Independence, there's the famous phrase, pursuit of happiness. So who am I to disagree with Thomas Jefferson and the founders? All right. But if we dig a little bit deeper, it's how they use the word pursuit. For us, it's the going for, the person, chasing something, active chasing of it. For them, in colonial times, in the English language, pursuit meant practice. So I like the practice of happiness, practice of joy. That gives it some meat on the bones, in my opinion. So
yeah, that's a great distinction. A lot of people, when they read pursuit, they're thinking like it's a chase, and we all know it's not. It's the chase. It's the journey. It's the active living it behaviorally. It's in our everyday actions and our thoughts, and what we do with these concepts that's most important, not the chase.
Great. Now, before we jump into your new book, Beyond Happiness, you wrote a book with Tony Hsieh called Delivering Happiness. So what more is there to say after you sold a million copies? So how did you build on that, Jenn? So
yeah, well, I built on it because when that book came out in 2010, that was largely based on Tony's story of his growing up, his Zappos time, what they did to become a success in their highs and lows. Eventually got bought by Amazon for $1.2 billion. Like huge success story. After that book came out, though, people were just like, oh yeah, that's cool. It can happen at Zappos, but it'll never happen where I work. And so I felt like that was a good challenge for myself. I wanted to prove them wrong. And so we started making these concepts more universal outside of what Zappos was doing, using that science of happiness and testing it, doing it with organizations. Half of our clients are still around the world. So it's been so amazing to see the progress that's being made using happiness in workplaces that actually generate more profit, productivity, and engagement with employees. So I really wanted to build on that and share those stories and share all that stats to basically reinforce and let people know that your own organization can be successful in this too. But then, of course, 2020 happened and we all got blindsided. COVID, recession, social unrest, and most personally, the passing of Tony. I know everyone listening to this has experienced some sort of loss or pain or grief during this time. So I was in the middle of writing this book, 5 weeks out from the due date. That's when Tony passed. And I had to process it all. And I had to actually deep dive back within myself to ask if these practices, these things we've seen over the last 11 years, are they actually true? And I took that time to come back out of it and understand that it's true now more than ever, that happiness is not just all highs, it's also our lows. It's also acknowledging our blind spots, are things that we need to work on within ourselves. And that includes our loss and pain and our own senses of lows within, mentally, emotionally, etc. So that's why I ended up calling the book Beyond Happiness. Is a reminder of what we really are going through in life and work, and that's more integrated than ever. So that was the purpose of getting this book out.
No, that's wonderful, the way you have this broader view. So you use the term beyond happiness. What do you mean by it, Jenn?
Yeah, I think because when we normally use the word happiness, and like in your case, like you're talking about joy, it conjures up certain things in our minds and conjures up certain images, things that make us happy. But I wanted to push the envelope a little bit because I've been having so many interesting conversations that from the C-level execs to frontliners that don't know what happiness actually means anymore. They're asking themselves, what does it mean now versus what it was before? And I think it's such a healthy sense of inquiry because we had so much time to think about this. And first time in the history of our generation, did this happen to the whole of humanity all at one time? So that's why I wanted to open up that conversation, create this safe space to say it's okay to question where we are with happiness and actually go beyond it. And for me, going beyond it is being inclusive of all of these things that are not just the highs, but also the lows. And, our workplaces are like that right now. We got to be honest with that.
Well, I like your sense of inquiry, and you must comes from your pursuit of science as it applies to happiness. And so, and it's when you say beyond happiness, and the way you described it, I'm thinking, well, what more is there? But I think we're going to find out what more there is. So what does it mean in the workplace? What is beyond happiness in the workplace, Jenn? So,
I think a big part of it now is that because I've been, doing this happiness stuff for so long, what I saw happen in the last 18 plus months was that happiness is not enough anymore to have in the workplace. It's important, but we also need the next level up, which is beyond, which is humanity. And bringing that sense of humanity into the workplace is something that we haven't really done well. And we're still working on happiness to say, but that level of humanity is what we need. I mean, we see this great resignation, millions of people leaving every month their job, a lot of them not even having a second job to go to. And that's amazing, even in a recession. So we're seeing a different power swing here, the balance of scales of not just people saying, C-levels and boardrooms saying this is what we're mandating. We're also seeing people that are standing up for what they believe in and what's right for them, or the people they love. So I think that's why it's so important as leaders. The more we can integrate that sense of not just happiness, but humanity, and treating people like their whole selves, not just for their skill set and not just for their role, but who they are as a human being, mentally, emotionally, financially, physically, and also spiritually from a purpose standpoint. And I think those you'll see those kind of companies that bring that sense of humanity were those that will be enduring and more sustainable because they're respecting the fact that that's what human beings need these days.
That's a very powerful concept, and it's looking at my employees not as employees or workers, but as human beings. And so much of what you were saying about the whole person, but about the connection we seek, and that's where my work in grace comes in. It's the caring, the compassion, and people want to feel, and the belonging. And I think feeling belonging, does that have a role in beyond happiness, Jenn? So
hugely, yeah. So it's actually, I talk about people ecosystems and how we can build those in our companies. And one of the greenhouse elements is belonging. And that's a huge one now, because I think in the past we can talk about connectedness, but that is not even nearly enough anymore, because we can have connected workplaces, but it could be like an old, boys network that's connected, whereas someone feels that wants belonging would not feel belonged in that network. So I think it's important to define what belonging means, and the same thing, it's important to find joy and define happiness and empathy, etc. But the belonging, I think, comes from when we as leaders create these workplaces where people feel authentically to themselves and to others, and feel embraced and acknowledged and safe to be that way. That's when we have true belonging.
Billy, I like to say that purpose is our why. It's been said by many, but grace becomes our how. And I would add that the how is what delivers our value proposition, which is what you're talking about, that sense of belonging. Do I fit in here? And can I express myself? And that gets into psychological safety. So it all goes together, at least in my small brain. So
seems pretty big to me, John.
Anyway, so you touched on a phrase, and I love this term because you build it out. Greenhouse values. What was it? Greenhouse. The concept of a greenhouse, nurturing a culture. So
yeah. So there's the people ecosystem standpoint of how we grow organizations, and the greenhouse metaphor I use is that nurture your greenhouse as you grow others, and it's basically the whole airplane oxygen mask, make sure you put yours on first before you put on others. And it's so counterintuitive sometimes, especially as leaders. Like, we want to make sure others are growing and developing, but sometimes we forget to apply it to ourselves. So that was another big point of what I wanted to share in the book.
Oh, that's good. Let's touch on that, because you are a CEO. You've been running this company for quite some time, at least a decade, if I'm not mistaken. And so that's important. So self-care for a leader do you address that? So
I do. I brought up a few stories in there because I think a lot of people, when they see leaders in media or in stories, they automatically assume they have it all figured out, and the reality is they don't. I mean, everyone is figuring it out the same. And I think why I bring up these stories is, like, they're successful on paper, but David Kidder, he had to go, like, he had to get broken down. The aggro walls that I talk about in the book, Keith Ferrazzi, another New York Times bestselling author, they had to break down to realize they weren't being real to themselves. So Keith talks about how he was living in shame. Here's this guy that's consulting, Fortune 50 CEOs and board people, and he was living in shame. And so being that honest with yourself is a big part of, number one, self-care, nurturing your greenhouse, and then being able to get there to even understand how we can nurture our greenhouse is breaking ourselves down first and understanding what are our internal blind spots. And this is caused by, historically, how we were raised, what trauma we might have had in our lives, the people that we surround ourselves today. So I think that's all part of, when you're saying self-care, that's the nurturing part of our own greenhouse as we, tend to want to care for others.
Right. Well, when in my coaching practice, I always talk about, taking care of yourself, which, because you can't be at your best, and your team really demands that you're at your best, but you can't be truly delivering if you're overlooking parts of yourself. So I like your emphasis on that. I love the way you use the word nurturing, because that's as well, and echoes with your greenhouse theme or image, but it gives us a gentle image, a supportive image in my mind. So,
yeah, thank you for pointing that out. It was intentional, because sometimes we get so hard on ourselves and we're our worst enemy.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's one thing with a group that I belong to. We talk about the imposter syndrome. And no matter how successful you are, all of us feel something a little bit, maybe I really don't belong. And there's a wonderful, wonderful story. One of my favorites is the great author, I'm sorry, I'm blanking out on his name. He's so famous, I can't think of him, but he was at a conference and Neil, oh gosh, I'm blanking out. And never mind. But he is a famous author, and he's at this conference, and there's an older gentleman standing next to him. And the older gentleman looks at Neil and he says, "Boy, I don't know how they invited me at this conference. There's so many accomplished people." And Neil looks up and he goes, "You're Neil Armstrong. You walked on the moon." And he goes, "Well, that was a team thing." And actually, if you know anything about Neil Armstrong, who was an extraordinary pilot and very brave, but also got a PhD in astrophysics or aeronautical engineer, and taught that too. So he was also at heart always a pilot, and that moon landing required every piloting skill he had ever had. So, but anyway, if Neil Armstrong can feel the imposter syndrome, who am I to deny it? So, but I think it's actually imposter syndrome, and I think it's back to your nurturing. I think it's a sign of acknowledging our personhood, the fact that we're imperfect beings, and we can always strive for better.
I agree, and that's a large, actually, component of what I'm talking about in Beyond Happiness is being that real to ourselves, being that gentle against criticism of ourselves. I actually read a really good book right before I started working on this book, and my brother sent it to me. It was perfect timing, and it's called the war of art. And it kind of speaks to what you're saying, because essentially we all have, especially when we're like, going to do this big project or whatever it might be, take on something huge. And sometimes we feel like there's no way, like, why did I get chosen to, who am I to write this book?
Yeah.
Imposter syndrome, etc. But he talks about how everyone, no matter who you are, has this level of resistance, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. And it's a daily practice that we wake up with these things. And sometimes the resistance is so loud and so big in our head. And sometimes they get softer when we feel that, we're on the right path of living our purpose and values. But it's just a reminder that, no one has it figured out. And it's a day by day journey.
Well, which leads us perfectly into your Beyond Happiness, because you're talking about creating a culture that nurture and sustain others. So if I'm feeling this imposter syndrome or the challenge, just as you said, about how am I going to write this book, or if I'm working at, I've been assigned this huge project, it's really going to be daunting, I want to do it, how can I do it? And that's where some of the supportive mechanisms or tools that you have in Beyond Happiness work.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, totally. So what, we've been talking about so far has been mostly revolving around what I call the individual self. But what, in order to really achieve where we want to go, we must operate as teams, obviously, and then the organization as a whole, and then therefore impact our customers, partners, and vendors, and everyone in this people ecosystem that we're touching. So to be able to do that is like, number one, when we go through that exercise of purpose and values and identifying it for ourselves, then if we can actually align that to that of our teams, then they get a sense that, hey, we're actually all, have our own set of purpose and values. But when you actually do these exercises and literally put them on the wall, you'd be surprised how many people's purposes are actually super aligned, if not exactly the same. And then they see the values that oh, wow, that's what I believe too. And then these conversations that they have are no longer about work focus, no longer about goal focus. It's important, but it's also a deeper layer of understanding of connection, belonging, that makes them operate better.
Yep. Well, and you know what? I'm listening to you here, and you have the terrific subtitle to the book. Would you tell me what it is? Because I have it. How authentic leaders prioritize purpose and people for growth and impact. I would say a word in there that's complementary, but it's so important, and it gets back to our idea of complement, is community. Following your practices, we can create community in our workspace. Would you agree?
100%, totally. I believe that actually our workplaces, our teams, our companies are actually our modern day villages. And especially now when we're remote and hybrid, we need that connection. We're just like human creatures. We're social. We need it. If we feel isolated, there's a stat out there that it's worse than smoking a pack of cigarettes a day if you feel isolation. So if we need that as human beings, we can think about it and reframe the way we look at work, because it is a sense of community. Our teams are, our customers are, and the more we can see it that way, is that we're building villages that impact and benefit each other. Then I think that's where this future of work that's actually happening now is where it's going to be.
That's a powerful concept. And it's interesting because we've had many shows on here and authors who specialize, or business leaders who talk about the hybrid workplace. I mean, that was here before COVID. COVID merely accelerated it. So it's not going away. So how does the work that Beyond Happiness deal with that? What special things must leaders be attuned to if my workforce is chiefly remote or partially virtual? What's the challenge there?
That's a huge one and a good question. But I think what is most helpful for leaders to think this through is that there's been a lot of companies before COVID, before this whole future of work concept got smashed in our face because we have to deal with it now. There are plenty of successful companies remote already. And so I think we need to learn from that, hey, this is not going to, of course there's going to be challenges, but let's learn from those who's doing it well. So for example, one of my friends, Matt Mullenweg, who founded WordPress, runs Automatic. started remote when they were tiny, and now they have over, I don't know, 1,200, 1,500 employees over the span of, even beyond COVID. So there's ways to do it. And he's huge about purpose. He's huge about this self-managed team. So everyone feels like they have autonomy. They're all nodes in an interconnected ecosystem, but they all have responsibilities, but we're all, aligned with our higher purpose. So
Right.
I think those are the things to keep in mind as we get more hybrid, more remote. It's been done before, so don't freak out. We can learn from that. And I think because it's, with technology, it feels like it can be a layer of distance, of disconnection. It doesn't have to be. And that's where culture comes in. That's where reminding people that we're here for other reasons besides driving more profit or making more revenue.
Right. The operative word there is culture, and the culture exists whether we acknowledge it or not. And it can be a bad culture. We always frame it, try to, as a positive, but it exists regardless. So if I'm in a virtual thing, and maybe there's a lesson from the gentleman that you described, is how do you keep community, or how do employees feel belong? How do they feel they belong if they don't go to a physical space? I guess.
Yeah, it's a big one. So what we do and what we've been doing, because delivering happiness has also been remote since 2010. We never had an office.
Okay. Well, why are we talking about other people? We need to talk about you.
So yeah, we've been guinea pigs on ourselves for all this time. And what we've seen is that once you establish and codify that purpose, those values, your behaviors that come out of those values, so they're not just meaningless words on the wall. Once you actually reward and recognize and incentivize people to live those values and not just, again, words on the wall, that's the foundational stuff. Then it's the programmatic stuff that you do systemically, by, again, rewarding, recognizing. Let's just say, like, as an example, a meeting. Instead of diving straight into the agenda, spend 5-10 minutes to engage and maybe talk about, hey, here's the one value that's, value of the day. Who in this room, Zoom room, has it, exhibited this value and why? Or just like say, take a few minutes just to say, hey, everyone in the chat, what's the one thing that, was most meaningful for you yesterday, or what are you grateful for? What are those are the kind of things that revolve around science of happiness. Then you actually see people like engaging. They're like, oh, wow, I just felt that too. And so there's side conversations, off conversations that are much more meaningful than what movie are you, binging on, or what show are you binging on Netflix or something like that.
Yeah. So Jenn, let me ask you then. So in the nature of your work in your company, so I'm assuming your colleagues collaborate or collaborate with one another to get things done, correct? So, okay. So, am I correct? So.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. So the connectedness comes from what you were just talking about, sharing them, the unity of purpose, knowing our values, the way we do things around here. So that's what you drill down on and practice.
Is that
correct? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
And makes it, okay. And so, I'm going to just throw you a spanner here. So if someone is new to the company, doesn't quite fit in yet, well-intentioned. So how do you bring them on board and show that they belong? Is there a special technique that we can learn from you? So,
well, a big part of it is the onboarding process, and we actually go through, even before onboarding, intentionally a long interview process, because after finding out there's a misalignment after, it makes it harder for everyone and more expensive for companies.
Sure.
So we tend to like to date, because it's not just us, it's making sure they're okay with us, because our culture is very specific and unique. And, one of our values is be true to your weird self. Not everyone can feel comfortable being weird, true to their weird self. So there's a lot of testing period of that, of just seeing whether or not there's alignment. And then there's the onboarding process. And then especially, we're such a tight company because we've been based on values for so long. So, yeah, we just kind of buddy it up, like whoever is working with whom. And you hire the people that are already smiling and have good values and want to be supportive of each other to begin with, then it's not as hard.
Well, no, and you hit the operative. It's peers are leading peers and bringing others, as you call the concept of buddy to buddy. So, sadly, Jenn, we are rushing through. I can go for another hour here, but we're coming to the end, and I ask every guest a story about grace. Do you have one that you want to share with us? So.
Story about grace. What immediately comes to mind, because I really believe, I mean, this is common, the true character of a person shows in the worst of conditions. I believe that the true character of a company shows in the worst of conditions. So I thought about grace a lot over the last 18 months, but I think where I remembered it from and where I learned it from first was when one of my best friends, and this is like 25 years ago, we were in college, and her dad passed away with lymphoma unexpectedly. And I remember, and they had such a tight relationship. I mean, they were really, really, really tight. But I knew how much that crushed her. But I remember that moment that when the time the funeral came, the service came, she walked up to the podium and she just exuded grace. Like, she could have gone any direction because I knew how hard it was for her to be in that moment. But her grace just kind of grounded her in her character. And that's where I was just like blown away. Like, that, I'll never forget that lesson of what grace really means.
Right. Well, what a powerful story. So thank you, Jenn. How can people find you? And we will put this in the notes.
Yeah, so we launched a new website for the book. It's just Jenn Lim, JENNLIM.com. Of course, we still have DeliveringHappiness.com. And also want to invite all your viewers to an event we're doing October 29th, because we can't do a regular book tour anymore. We're doing something called Beyond Happy Palooza, all-day event online. I'll be talking to a bunch of folks like Peter Diamandis, Adam Grant, Sean Aker about happiness, what's beyond. We got a little music going on. So anyway, wanted to offer that up to you and invite all your community as well.
Well, thank you. So appreciate that. We will put these in the notes. Jenn, it's been an honor to have you on the show. I know you're an extremely busy and a very accomplished person, so it's an honor to have you on the show. And with that, we'll close out. So
thank you so much, John. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.